On Christmas Eve, as crystal glasses clinked and carols floated through the Morgan estate, my father raised his glass and mocked, "Still single at 35, no wonder." The room erupted in laughter, every chuckle slicing deeper than the last. For years I had swallowed the shame hiding the life I built far from their judgment. But that night I stood, my voice steady, my heart pounding, and said, "Actually, I've been married for 3 years, and the truth I revealed would silence them all, forever changing what it meant to be a Morgan. My name is Rachel Morgan, and this is the story of the night my secret became impossible to hide." If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The chandeliers glowed so brightly above the dining table that every crystal sparkled like ice. The scent of roasted turkey and rosemary potatoes lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of mulled wine. The Morgan house in Greenwich had always been more stage than home, and tonight it felt like the grandest performance yet. I sat at the far end of the long, white-clothed table, half hidden behind a towering centerpiece of poinsettias and silver candles. My father, Richard Morgan, occupied his throne at the head, his wineglass already half empty, his voice booming above the soft hum of carols playing from hidden speakers. My mother, Evelyn, moved like a conductor directing an orchestra, straightening a napkin here, reminding the staff to refill glasses there. Her smile polite but taut, always aware of appearances. Jessica, my cousin, leaned in close to Matthew, her older brother animatedly discussing the long hours at her law firm. Matthew, in turn, bragged about surviving another brutal rotation at the hospital. Across from them, Patricia and Robert, my mother's sister and her husband, laughed on cue at whatever story floated down the table, their laughter carrying just enough volume to be heard by the right people. And me, I kept my head low, tracing the rim of my glass, feeling the familiar detachment settle over me. Nights like these, I was less a daughter than a prop in my father's tableau of success. My voice slipped into the quiet of my own mind. Every holiday felt like a performance, and I had never been given the lead role. The crystal rang as glasses lifted. "To family," my father declared. His gray hair gleamed under the chandelier, his cufflinks catching the light. Everyone repeated his words in unison like obedient parishioners. To family, voices echoed, wine swirling in crystal. I raised my glass halfway, barely touching it to my lips. I had learned long ago to play along just enough to avoid confrontation, but then his eyes, steel blue and sharp, landed on me. He tilted his head, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he had been waiting all evening for this. "Still single at 35, he said, his tone pitched perfectly between mockery and amusement. He paused, savoring the moment. No wonder. The words hung above the table like smoke. For a heartbeat, silence pressed against my ears, and then laughter erupted. Jessica giggled behind her manicured hand. Matthew chuckled, shaking his head. Even Robert allowed himself a smirk. My mother's laugh was the most controlled, measured a social cue for the others. Yet when her eyes flicked toward me, there was nothing warm there. Only the familiar look of disapproval, the silent reminder that I had failed to meet expectations she herself had married into. I bit down on my lower lip until I tasted copper. My hand tightened around the stem of my glass, the cool crystal slick against my palm. Every muscle in me wanted to shrink back into invisibility, to let the laughter wash over me the way I always had. But not tonight. I forced my mouth into a small, deliberate smile. Slowly, I lifted my glass, letting the stem catch the light, holding it just high enough for every pair of eyes to notice. I felt my father's gaze fix on me, his smirk daring me to speak. In my chest, my heart thudded like a drum. My voice, steady in my own head, whispered the thought I had kept buried for too long. "If you want an audience, Father, tonight you'll have one." The laughter dimmed to murmurs, and for a fleeting moment I savored the silence before the next act began. When I was a child in Greenwich, dinner at our house was never about food. It was a drill, a training session, an endless rehearsal for a role I never wanted. My father, Richard Morgan, would sit at the head of the table, his back straight like a soldier's, eyes trained on me as if waiting for a slip. "Back up, Rachel. Shoulders down. Chin level." If my posture faltered, the silver fork in his hand tapped against his plate, sharp as a gavel striking wood. Every bite was measured, every word inspected. If I mispronounced something, his correction came instantly, his tone clipped and public. Articulate. Speak properly or don't speak at all. His expectations were relentless. Perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect everything. My mother Evelyn played her part with equal precision, though her methods were quieter, colder. She rarely shouted. Instead, she wielded comparisons like scalpels. Margaret Hill's son Stephen just won first place at the state science fair, she would murmur while adjusting her pearl necklace. He's already talking about MIT. What have you achieved, Rachel? Her voice was sweet enough for company to hear, but the sting stayed with me long after the dishes were cleared. I grew up measuring myself against a boy I barely knew, the invisible benchmark who always seemed just out of reach. No award, no A+, no ribbon was ever enough to eclipse the imaginary Stephen my mother carried in her pocket like a talisman. When the house grew too heavy, I sought refuge in my Uncle James. He was Richard's younger brother, a history professor at the University of Chicago, visiting often enough to notice the tension, but powerless to change it. He had a warmth my father lacked, a quiet rebellion in the way he told me stories. While my father lectured about contracts and case law, James spoke of leaders who defied empires of voices that changed the course of history. You don't have to accept the world exactly as it's handed to you, he told me once when I was 13 and on the verge of tears over another harsh lecture. He handed me a worn book about abolitionists, pressing it into my hands as if it were a shield. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no. I carried that book under my pillow for years, the pages smudged from nights I read by flashlight. By the time I was 18, I thought I had found my escape. I had worked tirelessly through high school, not only meeting my father's impossible demands, but surpassing them. He assumed, perhaps even took for granted, that I would follow in his footsteps, applying to law schools in the Ivy League. Instead, when the acceptance letter from New York University arrived, I circled one word on the page: English literature. The night I told him, he set down his scotch with such force the ice cracked. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening in visible disbelief. English literature, he repeated, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. Yes, I said, keeping my voice steady. I want to write, I want to study stories. Stories, he spat the word out like it was an insult. You think stories will pay the bills? You think a daughter of mine is going to waste her future scribbling poetry? It's not wasting, I whispered. But he cut me off with a raised hand. Law is the future. Contracts, negotiations, power. That is how you secure your place in this world. You are throwing away everything I have built for you. My mother's silence was the cruelest. She stood beside him, her lips pressed tight. Her eyes filled not with pride, but with disappointment. She didn't have to speak. The message was clear. I was letting them both down. Weeks later, after another argument, my father presented me with documents in a stiff leather folder. He spoke as if he were reading a verdict. This is your trust. Substantial, carefully managed enough to secure your life. But it comes with conditions. You will have access when you marry someone I approve of. Until then, it remains out of reach. The paper was thick, expensive, embossed with his firm's seal, Chanel. My name looked foreign in print, bound by rules I hadn't agreed to. I felt my chest tighten as I realized what it meant. Even my future was a contract to him, my independence locked behind terms and signatures. That night, lying in my room beneath the heavy drapes, I traced the words with trembling fingers. The ink felt like chains. For the first time, I understood that in my father's eyes, love was conditional, affection was transactional. He didn't see me as a daughter. He saw me as a deal to be negotiated. The voice in my head was steady, cold, unflinching. He loves me like he loves a contract binding only as long as the terms are met. And with that realization, something inside me began to harden. I didn't know then what battles lay ahead, but I knew one truth. I could no longer mistake his control for care. By the time I reached my 20s, my life in Greenwich had become a carousel of cocktail parties and formal dinners. Every invitation was less about celebration and more about strategy each evening. Another chance for my father to parade me in front of what he considered eligible prospects. I wore dresses my mother selected, sat with my shoulders square as he had drilled into me since childhood, and smiled politely at strangers who appraised me like stock options. At these gatherings, the introductions followed a pattern. My father's hand would land firmly on my shoulder, steering me toward whichever man he'd deemed suitable that week. Rachel, this is David Johnson, one of the most promising neurosurgeons in the state. He's already performing complex procedures most doctors twice his age wouldn't attempt. My father's voice carried across the room, ensuring every guest heard the pedigree. David would extend a confident hand, his watch glinting beneath the chandeliers. He was polished, practiced every detail about him carefully arranged. But when his eyes met mine, there was no spark, only calculation. On another evening, it was Christopher Allen, a hedge fund manager barely into his 30s yet, already boasting a Manhattan apartment and membership at 2 exclusive golf clubs. My father beamed as if Christopher were a prize he had personally acquired. This is the kind of ambition you should admire, Rachel. Drive disciplined success. Christopher's smile was rehearsed, his grip firm. His attention divided between me and the older men whose approval he seemed to covet more. And then there was Tyler Brooks, a rising attorney from a family with the right last name and the right connections. My father introduced him as if announcing a victory. Tyler just secured a position at one of the top firms in New York. His future is secure, and so would yours be if you had the sense to see it. Tyler spoke smoothly, his words dripping with charm, but beneath the polish I sensed entitlement. A man who believed women were adornments to his career rather than partners in life. Each introduction blurred into the next. Their resumes were impeccable, their bank accounts enviable, their family names recognizable in the social registers my parents revered. And each time my father's gaze flicked to me, waiting for a nod, a smile, a sign of compliance. What I remember most vividly were the questions that followed. Guests leaned across linen-draped tables, champagne flutes in hand, asking the same thing in different tones. So, Rachel, when are we going to hear wedding bells? Your father tells us you've met such promising young men. Surely there must be someone special by now. I laughed politely, my cheeks burning, my answers vague. I became skilled at deflection, redirecting conversations toward careers, travels, anything but the hollow expectation that I was meant to be promised to one of these men. But my father had no patience for vagueness. He thrived on declarations. At one particularly crowded dinner, his voice carried above the clatter of silverware. "My daughter will be engaged before long," he announced, smiling toward David, who sat smugly across the table. "It's only a matter of time before we make it official." The room erupted in applause, glasses lifted in toasts, my mother's hand tightening on my arm, as if to keep me from betraying any dissent. Inside, I felt my chest constrict. I was standing there very much alive, yet spoken of as though I were property already promised. My name, my future casually bartered in public, my silence assumed. The breaking point came in the winter of 2015 at a country club wrapped in garlands and glowing lights. Snow fell thick outside the windows, the fire roaring in the hearth. The hall was crowded with the town's elite, all dressed in jewel tones and velvet. My father stood tall, glass raised high, the image of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his eyes sweeping across the room, finally settling on David at my side. "It gives me great pleasure to say that my daughter Rachel will soon be engaged. A match with Dr. Johnson would be a union of promise and tradition." The applause was deafening laughter and congratulations rippling through the room. David smiled, accepting handshakes as if the announcement were fact. My mother nodded, her expression composed, though her eyes betrayed triumph. But I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in the warmth of the fire, turning suffocating. My heart pounded as my father's words sank in the final humiliation of being spoken for without consent. I didn't wait for the toasts to die down. I slipped from the table, my chair scraping against polished wood ignored the whispers, as I pushed past clusters of guests. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap, the snow swirling under the golden glow of street lamps. My heels sank into drifts as I stumbled across the patio, my breath visible in sharp bursts. I leaned against the railing, snowflakes stinging my cheeks, and felt the tears come hot and fast. To them, I wasn't a person with choices or desires. I was an asset, a daughter with a name and pedigree to be matched strategically like a merger. The laughter and music spilled from the club behind me, muffled by the storm. My fingers clutched the railing until they ached. In that frozen silence with snow gathering on my hair and lashes, a single thought cut through the despair. I would not let him decide for me again. That night in the bitter cold of Greenwich, I made a vow. My life would not be dictated across banquet tables and champagne flutes. I would choose my path, even if it meant walking alone. Seattle greeted me with drizzle that clung to everything, the kind of mist that seeped into your hair and coat no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. In 2018, when I stepped off the plane with 2 suitcases and a heart still raw from Greenwich winters, I felt something close to relief. The skyline was gray, the streets slick, but there was a sense of anonymity here. No one knew me as Richard Morgan's daughter. I could simply be Rachel. Northbridge Technologies occupied a gleaming glass tower in downtown Seattle. On my first morning, I hurried through its maze of identical hallways, already late for a strategy meeting. The building smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, my heels clicking too loudly as I tried to find the right conference room. I turned a corner too quickly, and in the next instant, hot coffee splashed across a stranger's shirt. "Oh God," I gasped, clutching my empty cup. The man looked down at the spreading stain on his wrinkled blue button-down, then back up at me with a smile so warm it disarmed my panic. "Well," he said, brushing at the fabric with a napkin he pulled from his pocket. "This shirt was already on its last legs." "I guess you just did me a favor." He extended his hand. Daniel Hayes, software engineer, and now apparently walking billboard for Starbucks. Despite myself, I laughed, tension easing from my shoulders. His dark hair was slightly unruly glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, the opposite of the polished men my father paraded in front of me. He seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin, a quality I had rarely encountered. Daniel walked me to the meeting I was late for, pointing out the layout of the building with casual confidence. By the end of the day, he stopped by my desk and said, "Since I saved you from wandering aimlessly, the least you can do is join me for lunch tomorrow." His grin left no room for refusal. One lunch turned into 2, and soon we were eating together most days, tucked into a corner of the noisy cafeteria. We swapped stories about projects and colleagues, trading observations about office politics, but conversations often drifted away from work. He asked about my family, and though I kept my answers vague, he listened without judgment. When I admitted that I once loved photography but had given it up years ago, his eyebrows rose. "Why'd you stop?" I hesitated, the truth heavier than I wanted to admit. My parents thought it was a waste of time. They called it a hobby, not a career. I guess I believed them. Daniel leaned back, studying me. "That's ridiculous. If it matters to you, it matters. Doesn't need anyone else's stamp of approval." I looked away embarrassed by how much his words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they touched something I had buried. Over the months, our friendship grew in quiet, steady ways. He offered rides when the rain was relentless, left sticky notes with jokes on my computer screen, invited me to trivia nights with colleagues where his laugh carried louder than the music. He was different, light-hearted, without being shallow ambitious, without the sharp edges of entitlement. One evening after a long week of deadlines, Daniel suggested grabbing dinner. We ended up in a cozy diner, rain streaking the windows, neon light buzzing overhead. Over greasy fries and milkshakes, I confessed more than I intended about my father's expectations, the suffocating dinners, the constant comparisons. Daniel listened intently, not with pity, but with a kind of respect that unsettled me. When the check came, he didn't let me brush it aside with a joke. "Come on," he said. "You deserve better than letting their voices drown out yours. So what if you never become who they wanted? Maybe that's the point." Weeks later, on a Saturday night, he pulled up outside my apartment and told me to get in. "Where are we going?" I asked, laughing nervously as I buckled my seatbelt. "You'll see." We drove across the city to a small camera store, its windows glowing faintly in the drizzle. Daniel held the door open, the warm scent of leather straps and polished lenses rushing out to meet me. "Pick one," he said simply. I froze, staring at rows of cameras, my throat tight. "Daniel, I can't." "You can," he interrupted. "Life's too short to bury the things you love. You've been told too long that your passions don't matter. I'm telling you they do." His words unraveled me. I reached for a camera, my hands trembling as I tested the weight. It felt familiar, like something I had lost and just now recovered. Daniel pulled out his card before I could protest, paying with a grin. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. I clutched the box to my chest as though it were fragile, as though it might slip away if I loosened my grip. Tears blurred the streetlights, and I let them fall, no longer ashamed. For the first time in years, someone had told me I was enough, that what I wanted, what I dreamed, mattered. In that moment, standing on a wet Seattle sidewalk with a new camera pressed against my heart, I felt something break open inside me. It was the first time anyone had believed I was worthy of my own dreams. The train ride back to Greenwich in 2019 felt heavier than any commute I had ever taken. Daniel sat beside me, relaxed in his usual way, unaware of the storm waiting in my parents' home. He wore a simple blue button-down and dark slacks, his only concession to the weight of the evening. I caught our reflection in the window, my tailored dress next to his unassuming outfit, and wondered if the contrast would be the first thing my father noticed. When we walked through the front door of the Morgan house, the familiar scent of polished wood and Evelyn's lavender sachets rushed over me. My father was waiting in the parlor, a glass of bourbon in hand. His eyes swept over Daniel from head to toe, lingering on the shirt that wasn't pressed to perfection, the shoes that had clearly been worn more than once. "Daniel." My father said, his handshake firm, too firm, the kind meant to dominate. "Welcome." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied with ease, his smile genuine. If he felt the sting of my father's scrutiny, he didn't show it. At dinner, the tension was palpable. Silver cutlery clinked against fine china candlelight, flickered across polished mahogany, but conversation felt like cross-examination. Evelyn began, politely enough asking about Daniel's family. "My mother's a nurse," he said. "My dad taught high school math until he retired." Evelyn tilted her head, her lips curving into a thin smile. "Honorable work," she said, though her tone dripped with condescension. "But not the kind that builds legacy." Daniel nodded, unbothered. "They gave me everything I needed. Hard work, perseverance. I wouldn't be where I am without them." My father leaned forward, eyes sharp. "And where exactly are you?" Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. "I'm a software engineer at Northbridge. I enjoy building products that make people's lives easier." My father's brow arched. "And financially. Where does that put you?" "What's your salary?" Heat crawled up my neck. "Dad." "It's fine," Daniel said, his voice even. "I make enough to live comfortably. More importantly, I'm working on projects I believe in." The corners of my father's mouth twitched, a humorless laugh escaping. "Comfort doesn't buy homes in Greenwich. Belief doesn't pay private school tuition." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm not chasing titles or corner offices. I'm chasing the chance to create something that matters. 5 years from now, I want to look back and know I built tools that help people." For a moment, the room went still. Then my father leaned back in his chair and let out a sharp, derisive chuckle. "Not ambitious, not serious. That's what I hear." My mother's fork clinked softly against her plate. "Richard," she murmured, though her eyes stayed on me. Disappointment plain. Dinner dragged on the air, thick with judgment. I picked at my food appetite gone, while Daniel answered every pointed question with unshaken composure. When the plates were cleared and coffee poured, my father set down his cup with finality. "If you marry him," he said coldly, looking directly at me, Forget the trust. Forget everything I've built. You'll be on your own." The words landed like stones. My chest tightened, but I lifted my chin, refusing to let him see me break. Evelyn nodded slightly, her silence a seal of agreement. Daniel reached under the table, his hand brushing mine. His fingers were warm, steady, grounding me. I turned to look at him, and in that moment the noise of the dining room faded. "You're my choice," I whispered, low enough for only him to hear. "Not his." Daniel squeezed my hand, his smile small but resolute. Across the table, my father's eyes narrowed, but I didn't look away. For the first time, I let him see that his power over me was cracking. When the evening ended and we stepped out into the cool night air, I exhaled as though I had been holding my breath all my life. The mansion glowed behind us, perfect and hollow. Daniel slipped his arm around me, and though I knew storms lay ahead, I felt a quiet certainty. For once, I wasn't walking alone. The ferry cut across the gray waters of Puget Sound, the wind biting at my cheeks as I stood on the deck. Daniel slipped his jacket over my shoulders even though he was shivering himself. "Almost there," he said, nodding toward the faint outline of the San Juan Islands rising from the mist. I nodded, heart pounding, though I didn't know why. We had taken trips before. Hikes, drives, little getaways. But something about the way he kept squeezing my hand told me this was different. That evening, after a dinner of fresh salmon at a small inn by the shore, Daniel suggested a walk. The beach stretched wide and empty, the tide rolling in under a dark blue sky streaked with dying light. The air smelled of salt and pine. My hair whipped across my face as I followed him, both of us silent, except for the crunch of pebbles beneath our shoes. When he stopped, I almost stumbled into him. He turned his expression both nervous and steady, and then he lowered himself onto one knee. A small velvet box appeared in his hand, trembling slightly in the wind. "Rachel," he said, his voice breaking against the roar of the water. "I don't have much to offer in the way your family defines it. No legacy, no grand fortune. But I have a life I want to build. With you, a life filled with honesty, laughter, and love. Will you marry me?" The box snapped open, and inside was a simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught what little light remained. My throat closed, tears blurring my vision. I sank to my knees too, nodding as the sobs broke free. "Yes," I whispered, then louder. "Yes, Daniel, 1,000 times yes." His arms closed around me. The ring slid onto my finger, and the wind seemed to soften. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what my parents would say, or whether I measured up. I was thinking only of him, of us. 2 months later, we stood barefoot on a quiet beach in Friday Harbor, the sand damp and cool beneath our toes. The officiant's voice carried over the waves, his words simple and unadorned. Daniel's parents stood close by his mother, clutching tissues, his father beaming with pride. His sister and her husband snapped photos with a small camera, their laughter light and genuine. A few friends from Seattle had made the trip, adding to the warmth of the circle that formed around us. But no one from my side of the family was there. The Morgan name was absent, deliberately so. My mother hadn't called in months. My father hadn't softened since that dinner in Greenwich. Their silence was as loud as the ocean around us. As Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my dress. A message lit the screen. "Don't forget, you are a Morgan." My father's words, cutting even from hundreds of miles away. I stared at it for a moment, the letters burning into me like a brand. Then I pressed the button, shutting off the phone. I reached for Daniel's hand, holding it tighter. The officiant asked us to speak our vows. Daniel's voice was clear, each word soaked with love. When it was my turn, my voice shook, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. For so long, my choices were made for me. But today, I choose you. I choose our life together, whatever it brings. We kissed, and cheers rose from the small circle around us. Rose petals flew into the air, carried quickly by the wind. Daniel lifted me off the ground, spinning me in a burst of laughter I hadn't known I was capable of. Later, as the sun dipped into the water, we ate cake from paper plates, the frosting smudging our fingers. Grace, Daniel's sister, teased him about nearly dropping the ring in the sand. His father told stories of Daniel as a boy tinkering with radios until sparks flew. His mother hugged me tightly, whispering, "Welcome home." I smiled through tears, the hollow space where my family should have been both aching and strangely light. For once, the absence didn't crush me. That night, lying beside Daniel in the small inn room, the ocean pounding just beyond the window, I whispered into the dark, "This is the first time I've ever felt free." And I meant it. Grace was born on a gray October morning in 2021, her tiny cry piercing through the sterile hospital room like the clearest note of music I had ever heard. The moment the nurse placed her in my arms, the world shifted. Her skin was soft and pink, her dark hair damp against my chest. I whispered her name, Grace Morgan Hayes, and felt my heart splinter in two, half swelling with joy, half aching with fear of what my parents would do if they ever found out. Daniel leaned over, brushing a kiss across my forehead. "She's perfect," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes wet. And she was. Every inch of her was perfect. The months that followed were filled with chaos and sweetness. Our small house north of Seattle became a cocoon of new routines, midnight feedings, diaper changes, the soft hum of lullabies. Daniel built a vegetable garden in the backyard, rows of lettuce and tomatoes that he insisted would feed our family. I watched Grace crawl across the grass for the first time, her laughter carrying on the breeze, and I thought, this is what a home should feel like. But shadows lingered. By 2022, my father's calls had become more insistent. "Rachel," he said one evening, his voice crisp through the phone. "I met a young partner at the firm tonight. He's from an excellent family. You should have dinner with him." I pressed the phone to my ear, staring at Grace asleep in her crib. "Dad, I'm busy with work." "You're 32, he snapped. "You don't have the luxury of wasting years. The right man won't wait forever." I swallowed back the truth. The ring on my finger. The marriage certificate tucked in a safe, the child breathing softly in the next room. I'll think about it. I lied, hating myself for how easily the words came. It wasn't just the calls. At Northbridge Technologies, where I worked as a communications director, whispers began to circulate. A colleague pulled me aside one afternoon. "Rachel, off the record, there are rumors that you're unstable, that you're distracted by personal issues. The execs are questioning whether you're ready for a senior VP role." My stomach dropped. Weeks earlier, I had been considered for a promotion. Now the offer was gone. I didn't need confirmation to know where the rumors started. My father had always known how to pull strings, his network extending from Connecticut country clubs to corporate boardrooms in New York and beyond. He didn't have to say it aloud. If I wasn't going to play by his rules, he would make sure I stayed in place. Daniel noticed the shift in me. "What's wrong?" he asked one night as we cleared dinner plates, Grace babbling in her high chair. "Nothing." I lied at first, then shook my head. "It's my father. He's interfering again." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You can't let him keep doing this to you." I looked at our daughter, her chubby fingers clutching a spoon, her cheeks round with innocence. "I don't care what he does to me," I whispered, "but I won't let him touch her." By 2023, the double life had become unbearable. Whenever my parents visited Seattle, which thankfully was rare, I staged elaborate performances. I rented a tiny apartment near downtown, filled it with a single bed and sparse decor, pretending it was mine. Daniel would stay with friends, Grace with a trusted neighbor. My mother would comment on the space, her voice laced with judgment. "This place could use a man's touch," she said, once glancing around the staged apartment. I smiled tightly, my heart pounding, praying she wouldn't notice the absence of toys or baby clothes. I became skilled at compartmentalizing. At Northbridge, I was the polished professional, careful never to reveal too much. On calls with my parents, I was the dutiful daughter pretending to consider their suggestions. At home, I was Rachel, Hayes' wife, and mother, the truest version of myself. But the strain wore on me. Sleepless nights weren't just from Grace's cries. They were from mine muffled into pillows so Daniel wouldn't hear. One evening in late 2024, after a brutal day of battling office politics, I returned home to find Grace asleep on the couch, a picture book splayed across her chest. Daniel had fallen asleep beside her, his hand resting protectively on her tiny leg. I stood there frozen, watching the two people I loved most in the world. Something inside me broke open. I knelt beside Grace, brushing the hair from her forehead, whispering so softly, only I could hear. You'll never know this pressure. You'll never feel like you're only valuable if you meet someone else's standard. I swear it. The words tasted like iron, heavy and binding, but they were mine. I kissed her cheek, the weight of my vow settling deep in my bones. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping against the windows. The storm would keep coming. I knew that, but in that moment, as Grace stirred and pressed closer to Daniel in her sleep, I found my strength in the quiet promise I had made. When Daniel told me he was leaving Northbridge to start his own company, my stomach twisted with both fear and pride. We were still paying off the mortgage on our little house north of Seattle, still juggling daycare costs and sleepless nights with Grace, who was barely 2. Quitting a stable job for an idea felt reckless, yet when I looked at him, eyes bright with conviction, I couldn't bring myself to crush it. I believe in this, he said one evening at our kitchen table, the surface covered with scribbled notes and empty coffee mugs. A simple app that helps families manage their budgets, set savings goals, and cut through the noise. Not just for the wealthy. Something useful for everyone. I nodded slowly, hiding the tremor in my hands. Then we'll figure it out. The first year was brutal. Our savings thinned quickly. Daniel worked late nights in the garage, wires and monitors crowding the space where a car used to be. I picked up extra consulting projects on top of my full-time job at Northbridge, chasing deadlines while Grace tugged at my sleeve with picture books. There were nights when I cried quietly in the bathroom, the numbers in our checking account rattling in my head like chains. But Daniel never wavered. He worked with a handful of engineers who believed in the mission as much as he did. They coded through weekends, ran prototypes, tested features on battered laptops. It's not about the investors, Daniel told me, exhaustion shadowing his face, but determination burning brighter. It's about making something that works. By mid-2022, something shifted. A small angel investor came aboard, then another. The app, Hayes Tech, launched quietly on a rainy March morning. I expected silence, but downloads trickled in. Then reviews. Families saying it helped them pay off debt plan for college finally feel in control. The buzz grew. By the end of the year, a venture capital firm invested, and suddenly the company was valued at $40 million. I remember sitting on the porch with Daniel watching Grace chase bubbles across the lawn as he showed me the valuation papers. $40 million, he whispered, shaking his head. It doesn't feel real. I leaned my head on his shoulder, a laugh breaking through my disbelief. You did this. No, he corrected gently. We did this. Despite the headlines, Daniel stayed grounded. He still drove his old Honda, still wore the same wrinkled button-down, still tended his vegetable garden when he could steal an hour away from meetings. His humility was maddening and beautiful all at once. For me, the pride was complicated. Every article that celebrated Hayes Tech felt like a spark, threatening to ignite the fragile web of lies I had spun for years. I clipped one particularly glowing feature from a glossy tech magazine and tucked it into my desk drawer at home, away from curious eyes. Then came the night my father nearly uncovered everything. He had called unexpectedly to say he was in Seattle with 2 colleagues from his country club, men with booming voices and cufflinks that gleamed like mirrors. We'll stop by for a quick drink, he said, as if my consent were irrelevant. Panic surged through me. I shoved toys into closets, hid family photos of Daniel and Grace, and staged the living room to look like it belonged to a single woman. The magazine with Daniel's face on the cover. smiling headline blazing, "The app revolutionizing family finances," sat open on the coffee table. The doorbell rang before I could move it. My pulse roared in my ears. My father stepped inside first, his cologne sharp, his eyes sweeping the room. His friends followed, laughter booming their shoes, leaving droplets of rain on the rug. "You've kept the place tidy," he remarked, as though awarding me points on a test. His gaze skimmed dangerously close to the magazine. I moved quickly, pretending to set down a tray of glasses, my hand sliding the magazine beneath a stack of unopened mail. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. "Can I get you a drink, wine, whiskey?" He nodded absently, already regaling his friends with stories of old court cases. I poured my hands steady only because I willed them to be. As they sipped and laughed, I stood behind the counter, staring at the hidden magazine, my heart hammering. It had been so close. One glance and the walls I had built around my life would have collapsed in an instant. Later, when the door finally shut behind them, I leaned against it, sliding to the floor. My hands shook, my breath coming ragged. Upstairs, Grace stirred in her crib, and I pressed my palm to my chest, whispering to myself. The truth was always there, just under the surface, waiting to break through. And I knew one day it would. The call came early in December, sharp and commanding, the way my father's voice had always been. "Rachel," he said without preamble. "Christmas Eve. The family is gathering at the house. You will be there? Family has no room for absences." For a moment I just stared at the phone, Grace's laughter echoing in the background as she chased Daniel around the living room. I wanted to refuse to tell him I already had a family, one that didn't measure my worth by appearances. But the weight of years pressed down, and I heard myself murmur, "Yes, Dad." When I told Daniel, he set Grace down and crossed the room, his hand warm on my shoulder. "You can't keep running," he said gently. "If it gets too hard, call me. I'll bring Grace. We'll face it together." The night before I left, I packed a single suitcase, folding dresses carefully as though armor could be made from fabric. Daniel tucked a note into my palm before I boarded the flight to New York. "Remember who you are," it read in his messy scrawl. The Morgan house in Greenwich glittered against the winter night, every window lit wreaths on every door, a tree so tall it brushed the ceiling of the great hall. The driveway was lined with black cars and silver SUVs, chauffeurs waiting in the cold. Inside, a string quartet played carols, the notes floating above the hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses. I stepped into the dining room, my heels sinking slightly into the thick carpet. The table stretched almost the length of the room, polished to a mirror shine. Candles flickered in tall silver holders, casting light across crystal glasses filled with burgundy wine. Jessica, now 28, swept in wearing a fitted red dress, her laughter bright and practiced. "I just got word. I'll be named partner next year," she announced, her voice pitched for maximum reach. Guests clapped politely, murmurs of admiration following her like perfume. Matthew, 30, now adjusted his tie and leaned across the table. "I handled a neurosurgery case last week. Complicated, high risk. The patient's family said I saved his life." He delivered the line with practiced humility, and more applause followed. I sat quietly, my wine glass cool against my palm, watching the parade unfold. They boasted, and everyone nodded, just as they had nodded for decades at my father's declarations. Then, inevitably, the attention shifted. A pause stretched, and I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. My aunt tilted her head. "And you? Rachel, what about you?" My father's smirk widened, as if the moment had been scripted. Still single at 35, he said loudly, his words slicing through the air, "No wonder." Laughter rippled down the table, indulgent and mocking all at once. I caught Jessica's smirk, Matthew's pitying glance, Evelyn's polished smile hiding quiet disapproval. Heat rose in my cheeks, but I forced my lips into a curl that wasn't quite a smile. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the deep red catch the light. If they wanted a spectacle, I thought they would get one. I lifted my glass slowly, meeting my father's gaze across the sea of faces. Inside, my voice was steady calm in its defiance. If they wanted their entertainment tonight, I would give them something they never expected. Actually, the single word rang louder than I expected, cutting through the laughter, the carols drifting from the quartet, the clink of silverware. My voice carried down the length of the table, steady even as my pulse hammered in my ears. Every head turned. Jessica's smirk faltered. Matthew froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Evelyn's hand stilled on her wine glass, her eyes narrowing with a mix of confusion and caution. And my father, Richard, arched, one brow, lip still curled in that smug smile, certain I was about to deliver a self-deprecating joke to save face. I straightened my shoulders, the stem of the glass pressing into my palm. For years, I had been trained to sit small, to stay polite, to endure humiliation with a smile. Tonight, I let the silence settle, let it stretch until the weight of it shifted from me onto them. My father's voice broke, first sharp and dismissive. "Well, go on, Rachel. Don't leave us hanging." The room chuckled nervously, eager to return to the comfortable rhythm of mockery. But I didn't laugh. I looked him in the eye, my words measured. "Actually, I'm not single." The effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. The quartet's song reached a discordant end as the musicians exchanged startled glances. A fork clattered to the floor, ignored. The laughter vanished, replaced by a thick, uneasy silence. My father blinked, his smirk faltering. Excuse me, I'm not single," I repeated louder this time. I set my glass down carefully, the crystal ringing against the table. "I haven't been for years." Gasps rippled around me. My Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Matthew frowned, whispering something to his wife. Jessica's eyes widened, then narrowed, her curiosity mixing with suspicion. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice a controlled whisper. "Rachel, what are you saying?" I took a slow breath, willing my hands not to shake. "You sit here year after year treating me like a punchline, but the truth is you don't know me at all. You've never asked about my life, only whether it fits into your version of success. So let me clarify. I've been married for 3 years. A stunned murmur rippled down the table. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "Married." My father's chair scraped back slightly. "Impossible." "You would have told us." The fire roared louder in the hearth, but the room itself felt frozen. I met his glare without blinking. "Would I? You told me if I ever chose love over your approval, I would lose everything. So I made my choice. And I stopped waiting for your permission." For a moment his face went pale, then red. His hands tightened around his glass until I thought it might shatter. "You're lying," he hissed, but his voice trembled at the edges. "I'm not," I said softly, though every syllable landed like a stone. All around us my relatives sat rigid, their dinners cooling, their holiday cheer evaporated. They were waiting for more, for the rest of the truth I had carried like a hidden flame for years. The silence stretched again, thicker now, heavier, and as I stood there staring down my father in the glow of the Christmas candles, I felt the room tilt in my favor for the first time in my life. Every eye was on me, and I wasn't afraid anymore. "I've been married for 3 years, I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded against my ribs. "My husband's name is Daniel Hayes. He founded Hayes Tech, the company you've probably read about, the one just valued at $40 million. And we have a daughter. Her name is Grace." The words filled the room like smoke, dense and impossible to ignore. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clattered against porcelain. Patricia gasped, her manicured fingers flying to cover her mouth. At the far end of the table, Uncle James leaned back in his chair, a slow nod tugging at his lips, as though he'd been waiting years for this moment. My father's face went white, then flushed crimson. He slammed his glass down so hard a streak of red wine splashed across the linen tablecloth. "You've deceived us," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You've lied to this family for years." I stood taller, though my knees threatened to buckle. "No, You made it impossible for me to tell the truth. You gave me an ultimatum: obedience or exile. I chose freedom." Evelyn's breath caught audibly, her hand pressed to her chest. For once she had no script, no polished words. Her lips parted, closed, then parted again, but nothing came out. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then my father's fist slammed onto the table, rattling crystal and silverware. "Get out!" he thundered. "Out of my house!" Tonight, I didn't flinch. "Not this time!" Around me, relatives stirred. Patricia rose halfway from her seat, her voice trembling. "Richard, don't! She's your daughter! Stay out of this!" He snapped his eyes wild. But James spoke up, his tone calm but firm. "No, Richard. Enough. You've treated her like property her entire life, and now you punish her for creating a family of her own." The room fractured. Some nodded in agreement, voices rising in murmurs of dissent. Others sat stiffly, unwilling to challenge the man who ruled over every gathering. Jessica stared at me, her face caught between disbelief and fascination, while Matthew shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. My father shoved his chair back and stood his height, casting a shadow across the table. "She has disgraced the Morgans. She's chosen to betray us. And if anyone here condones this, then you betray me as well." His words cracked like a whip, but the hold they once had on me was gone. I drew in a long, shaky breath. "What I've chosen is a life without your conditions. Daniel loves me without asking for perfection. Grace will grow up knowing she is enough exactly as she is. I will not apologize for that." The clash of voices swelled. Protests, defenses, whispers. Evelyn remained frozen, her eyes glistening though no tears fell. My father's jaw clenched, rage radiating from every muscle. "Out!" he roared again, pointing toward the door. "You are no daughter of mine." For a beat, no one moved. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced my legs to carry me. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my napkin on the table and lifted my chin. As I turned to leave, chairs scraped against the floor. Patricia stepped to my side, her hand brushing my arm in silent solidarity. James rose too, his gaze locked on his brother. Disappointment carved deep into his face. I didn't look back at my father. I couldn't. The last thing I heard as I walked out of the dining room was the sound of arguments erupting behind me, the Morgan family splintering in the glow of Christmas candles. Uncle James was waiting in the foyer with my coat in hand. His eyes met mine, filled with a quiet sadness, and without a word, he took my suitcase and guided me out into the cold December night. The mansion's windows glowed behind us, muffled shouts echoing faintly through the glass as the family continued to splinter in my absence. The drive to the hotel was silent at first. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes streaking across the windshield, melting as soon as they touched the glass. I pressed my forehead against the window, my breath fogging the cold pain, my chest hollow. "You did the right thing," James said, finally, his voice low, steady. "Your father, he doesn't see it yet. But you did what he never could. Choose love over appearances." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. It doesn't feel like the right thing. It feels like I lost him all over again. James reached across the console and squeezed my hand. "Sometimes the loss is already there. You just finally stopped pretending it wasn't." At the hotel, he carried my suitcase inside, insisted on paying for the room despite my protests. At the door, he paused, studying me the way he had when I was a child, struggling under Richard's demands. "Your father's pride is a prison, Rachel. Don't let it become yours. Build something better for your daughter." I nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in my throat. The next morning, the airport was a blur of holiday travelers and blinking lights. I moved through it numb until I saw them. Daniel, standing tall. Grace perched on his hip, a construction paper sign clutched in her tiny hands. "Welcome home." "Mommy!" My knees nearly buckled. I ran to them, scooping Grace into my arms, burying my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and crayons. She wrapped her small arms around my neck and whispered, "Missed you, Mommy." Daniel's hand pressed firmly to my back, anchoring me. His voice was quiet, steady. "You're home now. That's all that matters." In the months that followed, the story of Hayes Tech exploded. Daniel's app was praised on national morning shows, profiled in business magazines, debated on financial podcasts. The valuation climbed higher, investors lined up, and suddenly his name was everywhere. Back in Connecticut, my father couldn't escape it. At his country club, where men measured themselves by portfolios and pedigrees, whispers followed him through the halls. "Morgan isn't Hayes, your son-in-law. You mean you passed on investing in Hayes Tech?" What a mistake that must feel like. I heard it from James, who relayed the gossip with a mix of sympathy and vindication. His face turned scarlet, he said. For a man who spent his life worshipping success, nothing stings more than realizing he bet on the wrong horse. One afternoon, months after that disastrous Christmas, an envelope appeared in our mailbox. My name written in Evelyn's flawless script stopped me cold. I sat at the kitchen table staring at it, Daniel across from me, waiting silently. When I finally opened it, her words spilled onto the page in careful loops. "Rachel, I have been thinking of you, of everything that was said. Perhaps we were too rigid, too focused on what we thought life should look like. If you will allow it, I would like to meet Grace. I don't want to miss any more of her life. Or yours." Tears blurred the ink as I set the letter down. Daniel reached for my hand. "It's a start," he said gently. "Not perfect, but a start." I didn't know what would come next, whether forgiveness could ever stretch far enough to heal the fractures, but I knew one thing: the power my parents once held over me was gone. Their approval was no longer my currency. That spring, as the tulips began to bloom in our Seattle yard, I watched Grace chase butterflies through Daniel's vegetable patch. Laughter bubbled from her like music, her curls catching the sunlight. I thought of the mansion in Greenwich, the endless performances, the suffocating expectations. And then I looked at my daughter, free, radiant, loved exactly as she was. My voice quiet but certain, carried only to myself. Family isn't the house you're born into. It's the love you choose, the respect you demand, the life you build when you finally decide to be free. Have you ever chosen your own happiness over what your family expected of you? Tell me how it felt. Because sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that make us who we truly are.